I've never told anyone this story before. Not my ex-wife, not my kids, not even the therapist the VA made me see after I got back from Afghanistan. But something happened to me at St. Mary's Regional Hospital in Wheeling, West Virginia, that still keeps me awake at night. It's been 3 years now, and I still check my locks twice before bed. If you work nights, if you've ever felt like someone was watching you, you need to hear this. My name is Marcus, and I used to be a security guard. I say used to because after what happened, I can't bring myself to work another night shift. Ever. I took the job at St. Mary's because I needed the money. Single dad, 2 kids, and the disability checks from my Army days weren't cutting it. The hospital was this massive complex built back in the 60s, all concrete and fluorescent lights. During the day, it buzzed with activity. Doctors, nurses, patients, families. But at night? At night, it became something else entirely. My shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. 8 hours of walking empty corridors, checking doors, and watching security monitors that showed nothing but shadows and the occasional janitor. The hospital had 6 floors, 3 wings, and a basement that always smelled like disinfectant and something else I could never quite identify. The first few weeks were routine. I'd make my rounds every hour, check the cameras, write in the logbook. The hardest part was staying awake around 3 in the morning when the whole place felt like a tomb. But I managed. I'd been through worse in Kandahar. It started small, little things that didn't seem important at first. I'd come back to my security office after a patrol and find my coffee cup turned slightly to the left. Not enough to spill, just moved. I figured it was the cleaning crew, even though they weren't supposed to be in the security office. Then I noticed my chair would be adjusted differently, raised or lowered just a notch from where I'd left it. The logbook was the first thing that really bothered me. I kept detailed notes about my patrols, times, anything unusual. It was habit from the military. But one morning, I found entries written in handwriting that wasn't mine. Neat, precise notes about my patrol times, which routes I took, how long I spent in each area. At first, I thought maybe the day shift guy was adding notes, but when I asked him, he looked at me like I was crazy. Someone was studying me. The security cameras were old, installed probably 10 years ago, with blind spots and fuzzy picture quality. But they covered the main corridors, entrances, and most of the patient areas. During my first month, I started noticing something odd in the footage. Occasionally, a camera would be pointing in the wrong direction, like someone had manually adjusted it. When I'd go to fix it, I'd find it was already back to normal by the time I got there. Then I started seeing movement in areas that should have been empty, just glimpses. A shadow turning a corner, a figure in scrubs disappearing through a doorway. Always just out of clear view, always in the peripheral vision of the cameras. I'd radio the nurses' stations to see if anyone was doing late rounds in those areas, but they'd always say, no. The psychiatric ward had been closed for renovation 6 months before I started. Whole 4th floor, east wing. Doors were supposed to be locked, access restricted. But sometimes, late at night, I'd see lights flickering in those windows from outside. When I'd check the breaker box, all the circuits for that floor showed as off. Someone was using that wing. One night in my 2nd month, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and master keys and headed up to the 4th floor. The door to the psychiatric ward should have been locked, but when I tried the handle, it opened. The hallway beyond was dark, but I could smell something. Not the usual hospital smell. Something organic, like someone had been living there. I followed the scent down the corridor, checking each room. Most were empty, just bare walls and hospital beds covered in dust. But at the end of the hall, I found a room that was different. Clean. The bed was made. There were empty food containers on the nightstand, and when I touched the pillow, it was still warm. Someone had just been there. That's when I heard footsteps in the corridor behind me. Slow, deliberate, like someone trying not to make noise but not quite succeeding. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard my name, whispered so quietly I almost thought I'd imagined it. Marcus. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, and I heard a door close somewhere in the distance. When I finally worked up the courage to leave that room, the corridor was empty. But on the floor, right outside the door, someone had left a piece of paper. It was a photocopy of my employee badge, with notes written around the edges in that same neat handwriting I'd seen in the logbook. Notes about what time I'd arrived at work, what I'd eaten for dinner, what radio station I'd been listening to in my car. Details no one should have known, unless they'd been watching me. They weren't just in the hospital. They'd been following me home. I started varying my patrol routes, trying to be unpredictable. But it didn't matter. Whoever was watching me seemed to know my new patterns before I'd even established them. I'd find fresh notes in my locker, tucked into my jacket pocket, slipped under my windshield wipers. Always the same neat handwriting, always with details about my life that got more and more personal. They knew my kids' names. They knew what school they went to. They knew my ex-wife's address. The security footage started showing more activity. Never clear shots, but enough to see that someone in hospital scrubs was moving through the building during my shifts. They stayed in the blind spots, moved when they knew I'd be on the opposite side of the building. It was like they had my patrol schedule memorized, because they did. One night, I found a complete copy of my schedule in the abandoned psychiatric ward, annotated with notes about my habits. What time I took my breaks, where I liked to eat my lunch, which bathrooms I used. At the bottom of the page, someone had written, "Subject maintains consistent patterns. Ready for Phase 2. Phase 2. I started carrying my personal phone to record evidence, but the battery would die whenever I entered certain areas of the hospital. My radio would fill with static in the same spots. It was like whoever was doing this had mapped out the electronic interference points and was using them to stay hidden. The notes kept coming, but now they were different. Instead of just observations, they contained threats. Your daughter walks to school alone on Tuesdays. Your son plays in the backyard at 4 p.m. Your ex-wife leaves her bedroom window unlocked. If you're still listening to this, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. I don't usually ask, but if this story is getting under your skin, show it some love. It really helps. I had to know who was doing this. So one night, instead of making my regular patrol, I hid in the security office with the lights off and watched the monitors. Around 2 a.m., I saw movement in the psychiatric ward. A figure in scrubs, but this time they didn't stay in the blind spots. They walked directly to one of the cameras and looked up at it. They looked right at me. Even through the grainy footage, I could see it was a woman. Asian features, long black hair, hospital badge hanging from her neck. She smiled and waved at the camera, like she knew I was watching. Then she held up a piece of paper with something written on it. I zoomed in on the monitor and felt my blood turn to ice. It was my home address, with a floor plan of my house drawn below it. Every room, every door, every window. And at the bottom, "See you soon, Marcus." I ran to the psychiatric ward, but by the time I got there, she was gone. The room where I'd seen her was empty, but there was something on the bed. A hospital badge. I picked it up and read the name. Doctor. Sarah Chen, psychiatrist. The photo on the badge matched the woman I'd seen on the security camera, but there was something else written on the back in that same neat handwriting. Died March 15th. Car accident on Route 40. But I'm still watching. I researched doctor. Chen the next day. She had died in a car accident 6 months ago, just 2 weeks before I'd started working at the hospital. Single car crash on a rainy night, ruled an accident. She'd been driving home from her evening shift in the psychiatric ward when she lost control and hit a tree. The same psychiatric ward where someone had been living. The same ward where I'd been finding the notes. She'd never left the hospital. I quit that night. Didn't give 2 weeks' notice. Didn't finish my shift. I packed my things, drove home, and told my kids we were moving. I didn't explain why, just said I'd found a better job in another city. We were gone within a week, but it didn't end there. At my new job, daytime security at a mall in Ohio, I started finding familiar notes in my locker. The same neat handwriting, the same detailed observations about my habits. And last week, I saw her. Dr. Sarah Chen, standing in the food court, wearing the same hospital scrubs, watching me from across the concourse. When I blinked, she was gone. But on the table where she'd been standing, someone had left a note. Distance doesn't matter, Marcus. I'll always be watching. I still check my locks twice every night. I still vary my routes to work. And sometimes, late at night, I catch glimpses of a woman in hospital scrubs standing under streetlights, just watching. She followed me home once. Now she follows me everywhere. Look, I've been driving trucks for 18 years. I've seen every kind of crazy you can imagine out on the road. Road rage, drunk drivers, people who think an 80,000-pound rig can stop on a dime. But what happened to me on Interstate 80 last spring? That wasn't crazy. That was something else. Something planned. My name's Jenny Rodriguez, and I haul freight from the West Coast to Chicago and back. It's good money, and I like being my own boss out there. Just me, my truck, and the open road. At least, that's how it used to be. It started outside Reno, Nevada. I was loaded down with electronics heading east, making good time despite the construction zones. The desert stretched out on both sides of the highway. Nothing but sagebrush and mountains for miles. Perfect weather. Light traffic. Should have been an easy run. That's when I first noticed the white sedan. At first, it didn't seem like anything special. 4-door, looked like a rental car, tinted windows. It pulled onto Interstate 80 from an on-ramp and settled into traffic about a quarter mile behind me. Lots of cars travel the same direction on the interstate, so I didn't think much of it. But after 2 hours, it was still there. Same distance, same position. When I'd change lanes to pass slower traffic, it would change lanes too. When I'd speed up or slow down, it would adjust its speed to maintain that exact quarter-mile gap. That's when I knew I was being followed. I pulled into a truck stop outside Winnemucca to fuel up and grab some coffee. The white sedan didn't follow me into the truck stop, but I could see it parked at a gas station across the street. Driver stayed in the car, just sitting there, waiting. When I pulled back onto the highway, the sedan was right there in my mirrors again. Same distance, same position. Like we were connected by an invisible chain, I tried everything I could think of. Sudden lane changes, taking random exits, and getting right back on, varying my speed. Nothing worked. The sedan driver seemed to know what I was going to do before I did it. Every time I thought I'd lost them, they'd reappear in my mirrors exactly where they'd been before. By the time I hit the Utah border, I was getting scared. I grabbed my CB radio and put out a call to other truckers. Breaker 19. This is Roadrunner Jenny, eastbound on I-80. Anyone else seeing a white sedan that's been following traffic for the last 4 hours? The response I got made my skin crawl. Roadrunner Jenny, this is Mountain Mike. Been seeing that car for the past week. Different license plates each time, but same vehicle. You're not the first driver to report being followed. Different license plates. That night, I parked at a rest area outside Salt Lake City. The sedan pulled into the parking area but stayed at the far end, lights off. I locked my cab doors and tried to get some sleep. But every time I looked out my window, I could see the silhouette of someone sitting in that car, just watching. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside my truck. Slow, deliberate, circling the cab. I grabbed my flashlight and pepper spray, but when I looked out the windows, I didn't see anyone. The sedan was gone. But tucked under my windshield wiper, I found a note. "Nice truck, Jenny. Clean cab, good maintenance. You take care of your equipment. I wonder how well you take care of yourself." The handwriting was neat, precise. At the bottom, someone had written my route schedule for the next 3 days. Routes I hadn't even finalized yet. They knew where I was going before I did. I called my dispatcher first thing in the morning, told him I needed to change my route, take a different highway, different stops. He wasn't happy about it, but he agreed. I figured if I could get off I-80, maybe I could lose my tail. Didn't work. 2 hours after I'd changed my route and was heading north on I-84, the white sedan appeared in my mirrors again. Same distance, same position. But now the license plate was different. California plates instead of Nevada. How many cars did they have? I started documenting everything. License plate numbers, times, locations, every truck stop, every rest area, every time the car appeared or disappeared. The pattern that emerged was terrifying. They weren't just following me randomly. They knew my schedule, my preferred routes, even my backup plans. When I'd call ahead to reserve parking at truck stops, they'd already be there waiting. When I'd decide to take an alternate route at the last minute, they'd somehow anticipate it and position themselves accordingly. The notes kept appearing. Under my windshield wipers, tucked into my door handles, slipped through the mail slot at truck stops when I went inside. Always the same neat handwriting, always with details they shouldn't have known. You like the meatloaf at the Flying J in Little America. Your ex-husband called while you were fueling in Cheyenne. Your daughter's recital is next Thursday at 7 p.m. They were listening to my phone calls. I bought a new cell phone, changed my number, didn't tell anyone except my dispatcher and my daughter. Didn't matter. The next note contained details from a conversation I'd had on the new phone just an hour before. That's when I realized this wasn't just one person in one car. This was organized. Multiple vehicles. Multiple people. Coordinated surveillance. And they had access to resources. Phone taps. Probably law enforcement contacts. Definitely more than one vehicle. I was being hunted. The breakthrough came when I started talking to other truckers on the CB. Turns out, I wasn't the only one. Over the past 6 months, at least 12 drivers had reported being followed by white sedans on I-80 through Nevada and Utah. Same pattern, same behavior. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. 3 of those drivers had gone missing. Not officially missing, not reported to police. Just gone. There. Trucks found abandoned at rest stops, keys in the ignition, no sign of struggle. Companies wrote them off as drivers who'd skipped out on their loads. But the other truckers knew better. Someone was taking drivers. I decided to get off the highway system completely. Instead of continuing east, I took a state highway north into Idaho, planning to loop around through Montana and avoid the interstate altogether. It was going to add 2 days to my trip, but I didn't care. The white sedan followed me off the interstate. By this point, I was documenting everything with my dashboard camera. Hours of footage showing the sedan maintaining that exact distance, changing license plates at truck stops, never getting close enough for a clear view of the driver. I called 911 when I hit a small town in northern Utah. Told the dispatcher I was being followed, that I was scared for my safety. The sheriff's deputy who responded was polite but skeptical. What crime was being committed? The sedan was maintaining a legal distance, not speeding, not driving recklessly. Following someone on public roads wasn't technically illegal unless there were direct threats. But then the deputy asked to see my documentation. I showed him my logbook, my photos of the notes, the license plate numbers I'd recorded. His expression changed. "Ma'am, I need you to follow me to the station. There's something you need to see." At the sheriff's station, he pulled out a file folder. Inside were reports from other truckers, all describing the same white sedan, the same following behavior. But there was something else in the file that made my hands shake. 3 missing person reports. The drivers who disappeared had all filed complaints about being followed in the weeks before they vanished. All had been driving the same route through Utah and Nevada. All had reported finding notes with personal information they hadn't shared with anyone. "We think there's a group operating along this corridor," the deputy told me, "targeting long-haul drivers, especially women driving alone. We've been trying to gather enough evidence to involve the FBI, but..." He didn't need to finish. I knew what he was going to say. The followers were careful, probably had inside information, and weren't technically breaking any laws until it was too late. They were professionals. The deputy offered to escort me to the state line, but I had a better idea. I called my company and told them I was having mechanical problems, needed to leave my truck at a repair shop and fly home. It was partly true. I was having problems, just not mechanical ones. I parked my rig at a truck stop outside Salt Lake City and caught a flight back to California. Left everything in the cab, except my personal items and my documentation. I figured if they wanted the truck, they could have it. It wasn't worth my life. 2 days later, my company called. My truck had been found abandoned at a rest stop 50 miles away from where I'd left it. Keys in the ignition. No sign of damage or struggle, just like the others. But this time, there was a note on the driver's seat. "Thanks for the truck, Jenny. Don't worry, we'll take good care of it. Too bad you weren't in it when we came to collect." I don't drive long haul anymore. I got a local job running deliveries around Los Angeles, home every night, never more than 50 miles from the depot. It's boring work, and the pay is terrible, but I'm alive. Most nights, anyway. Because sometimes, when I'm driving local routes, I still see them. White sedans with tinted windows, maintaining that exact distance in my mirrors. Different plates, different cars, but the same feeling of being watched. Being hunted. Last week, I found a note tucked under my apartment door. Same neat handwriting. "New job, Jenny? We like your new route. Much easier to follow you home. Distance doesn't matter. They'll always find you." I moved to Maple Heights after my divorce because I wanted somewhere safe for my kids. Columbus suburb, good schools, tree-lined streets where neighbors wave when you walk by. The kind of place where the biggest crime is someone forgetting to put their trash cans away after pickup day. My name is Lisa Park, and I'm here to tell you that the safest-looking neighborhoods can hide the most dangerous secrets. The house was perfect for us. 3 bedrooms, fenced backyard, quiet cul-de-sac. My kids, Emma and Jake, were 7 and 10, and they needed stability after watching their father and me tear each other apart for 2 years. This house felt like a fresh start. The neighbor's house was identical to mine, part of the same development built in the 80s. Same layout, same windows, same everything. The only difference was that Mr. Hartman kept all his curtains drawn except for one upstairs window that faced directly into my kitchen. I first noticed him watching during my morning coffee routine. I'm an early riser, always have been, so I'd be up at 6 a.m. making breakfast for the kids and getting ready for work. That's when I'd see him, a silhouette in that upstairs window, just standing there, looking. At first I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was an early riser too. Maybe he was just looking out at the sunrise. Neighbors see neighbors, that's normal. But after a few weeks I realized he wasn't looking at the sunrise. He was looking at me. The kids mentioned him before I worked up the courage to bring it up. Emma, my 7-year-old, asked why the man in the window never waved back when she waved at him. Jake, who's more observant, said the watching man made him uncomfortable when he was playing in the backyard. The watching man, that's what they called him. I started paying closer attention to when he was at the window. 6 a.m. when I was making coffee. 3 p.m. when the kids got home from school. 7 p.m. when we were having dinner. 9 p.m. when I was cleaning up the kitchen. Always the same window, always the same silhouette. He was learning our schedule. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was elderly and had nothing else to do. Maybe he was disabled and couldn't get around much. Maybe he was just lonely. But then I started noticing other things. My garden stones had been moved. Not stolen, just rearranged. The solar lights along my walkway were repositioned, angled toward my windows instead of the path. My trash had been gone through, not scattered, but carefully searched and repacked. Someone had been in my yard. I bought security cameras for the obvious spots: front door, driveway, backyard. But the weird incidents kept happening in the blind spots. Whoever was doing this knew exactly where the cameras were pointed. That's when I started varying my routine. Different times for coffee, different rooms for dinner, different activities in different parts of the house. But no matter what I did, that silhouette was always in the window at exactly the right time to watch whatever I was doing. He knew my new schedule before I did. The breakthrough came when I was talking to my neighbor across the street, Mrs. Patterson. She's lived in the neighborhood for 20 years and knows everyone's business. I mentioned that Mr. Hartman seemed to be at his window a lot, and her expression changed. "Honey, Mr. Hartman asked me some very specific questions about you when you moved in. What time you leave for work, whether you have a boyfriend, what your work schedule is like. I thought he was just being neighborly, but now that you mention it." He'd been gathering information. I started documenting when I saw him at the window. 6 a.m. every day for exactly 15 minutes. 3 p.m. every weekday for 30 minutes. 7 p.m. every evening for the duration of dinner. The timing was too precise to be casual observation. Then I caught him taking pictures. I was working in my garden on a Saturday morning when I saw a flash of light from his window. I looked up and saw him with what looked like a camera, with a long lens, pointed directly at me. When he realized I was looking, he stepped back from the window. He was documenting me. I called the police, but they weren't much help. Officer Martinez was polite, but explained that watching from his own property wasn't illegal. Taking pictures from his own house toward public areas wasn't illegal. They'd talk to him, but unless he was trespassing or making direct threats, there wasn't much they could do. "Has he approached you or your children directly?" Officer Martinez asked. "No, but has he left any threatening notes or messages?" "Not exactly, but then we can't really call it stalking, ma'am." That afternoon, I found a package on my front porch. No return address, no delivery slip. Inside was a photo album. Pictures of me, hundreds of them. Me making coffee in my kitchen. Me walking to my car. Me grocery shopping. Me at my kids' school pickup. Me in my backyard. Me through my living room window watching TV. Some of the photos were taken from his upstairs window, but others were taken from much closer. Some were taken inside stores, parking lots, places where he couldn't have been watching from his house. He'd been following me everywhere. At the bottom of the box was a note. "You're very photogenic, Lisa. Your children are beautiful too. Emma looks just like you." I grabbed my kids and drove straight to the police station. This time, they took it seriously. Detective Williams looked through the photo album and agreed it constituted stalking and harassment. They'd get a search warrant for his house and arrest him for criminal stalking. But when they went to serve the warrant, Mr. Hartman was gone. The house was empty. Not just empty. Cleaned out. No furniture, no personal belongings, no indication anyone had ever lived there. The only things left behind were in the upstairs room facing my house. The watching room. Detective Williams described it to me later. Cameras with telephoto lenses on tripods pointing at my house. Charts tracking my daily schedule. Maps of my neighborhood with my regular routes marked. Photos covering every inch of the walls, not just of me, but of the previous family who'd lived in my house. He'd done this before. The previous owners were the Morrison family. Husband, wife, 2 young children. They'd moved out suddenly 18 months ago, right around the time Mr. Hartman had moved in. I contacted them through Facebook and asked if they'd mind talking about why they'd moved. The conversation gave me chills. Mrs. Morrison described the exact same pattern. The watching from the window, the moved garden stones, the photographs. But in their case, it had escalated. Mr. Hartman had started leaving notes about their children's schedules, details about their work routines, personal information he couldn't have known unless he'd been listening to their private conversations or had access to their house. We found evidence he'd been inside our home while we were away, Mrs. Morrison told me. Personal items moved, photos missing from albums, Emma's bedroom rearranged. The police said they couldn't prove it, but we knew. We moved 3 states away just to feel safe again. Emma. Their daughter was also named Emma. I started researching the house across the street. Property records showed it had been sold 4 different times in the past 6 years. Each time to a single man with a different name, each time paid for in cash. But the driver's license photos in the real estate documents all showed the same person. Mr. Hartman wasn't his real name. Detective Williams ran the photos through facial recognition databases and got a hit. The man I knew as Mr. Hartman was actually named David Chen, no relation to Doctor. Sarah Chen from my last story, just a coincidence that haunted me. He had arrests in 3 different states for stalking, voyeurism, and breaking and entering. He'd been systematically targeting single mothers with young children, studying them for months before escalating to home invasion. But they'd never been able to convict him. He was careful. Never left physical evidence of breaking and entering. Never made direct threats. Always stayed just on the legal side of surveillance laws. And whenever law enforcement got close, he'd disappear and set up shop somewhere else. The FBI got involved because he'd crossed state lines and shown a pattern of following families who moved to escape him. They traced his finances and found he was using multiple identities, had resources that suggested he wasn't working alone. He was part of a network. We moved again. Different state, different name, different everything. I got a job in Portland, Oregon, put the kids in new schools, rented an apartment in a complex with security and no single-family homes nearby. For 6 months, everything was normal. No watching, no photographs, no moved objects. The kids started sleeping through the night again. I started feeling like myself again. Then I found the new photo album. Same packaging, same anonymous delivery. But this time, the photos were of our new life. Me at my new job, the kids at their new school, our apartment building, our new routines. And at the bottom, a note. Distance doesn't matter, Lisa. I'll always find you. The last photo in the album was taken from inside our apartment building. Me checking the mail, shot from behind the security desk in the lobby. He had access to our building. I called Detective Williams, but there wasn't much the Columbus police could do from 3 states away. The Portland police were helpful, but explained that they couldn't arrest someone for taking photos in public places. I'd need evidence of direct threats or trespassing. That evidence came 2 weeks later. I woke up at 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and saw a figure standing in my bedroom doorway, just standing there, watching me sleep. In the dark, I couldn't make out features, but I could see the silhouette clearly outlined against the hallway light. He was inside my apartment. I screamed, and the figure disappeared. I grabbed the kids and locked us in the bathroom while I called 911. When police arrived, they found the front door unlocked and evidence that someone had been inside. But no fingerprints, no security footage, no trace of who it had been. Except for one thing. On my kitchen table, someone had left a floor plan of my apartment with notes about our sleeping schedules, what time I left for work, which school the kids attended. At the bottom, soon, Lisa. Very soon. We left that night. Didn't pack, didn't give notice, just drove to a hotel and then kept driving. I called my sister in Phoenix, and she agreed to let us stay with her while I figured out what to do. But I know he'll find us again. Because 2 days ago, Emma found a note in her backpack when she got home from her new school. Hello, Emma. You've grown so much since Columbus. Tell your mother I said hello. Some watchers never stop watching. I became a park ranger because I wanted to make a difference. Protect the wilderness, educate visitors, preserve something beautiful for future generations. What I didn't expect was to become the one who needed protection. My name is David Thompson, and what happened to me in the Olympic National Forest changed everything I thought I knew about being alone in the wilderness. I was assigned to the remote service roads in the northern section of the park. Miles from the main visitor areas, these roads were used mainly for maintenance vehicles and the occasional research team. My job was to keep them clear of fallen trees, check for erosion damage, and maintain the small ranger stations scattered throughout that section of forest. It was perfect for someone like me. I'd grown up in suburban Denver, always felt more comfortable outdoors than around people. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I preferred it. Just me, my truck, and thousands of acres of old-growth forest. The area I covered was huge. It would take me 3 days to complete a full circuit of all the roads, checking each route and maintaining the facilities. I'd radio in twice a day to the main station, but otherwise I was completely on my own. That's when the watching started. It began small, things that could have been explained by wildlife or other park personnel. I'd stop to clear a fallen branch and come back to find my lunch had been moved from the truck cab to the hood. Not eaten, just relocated. I figured it was ravens, or maybe a bear, even though bears don't usually rearrange things so neatly. Then I started noticing boot prints in the mud alongside the service roads. Human prints, size 10 or 11, following the same route I'd driven. At first, I assumed it was hikers who'd gotten lost and ended up on the service roads. It happens more often than you'd think. But these prints were always exactly where I'd stopped. If I got out to clear debris at mile marker 7, there would be boot prints around mile marker 7 the next day. If I checked a ranger station at the end of Forest Road 23, those same boot prints would be all around the station the following morning. Someone was following my exact route. I started paying closer attention to my surroundings. The Olympic Peninsula is dense forest, old-growth cedar and fir trees that create a canopy so thick it stays dim even at noon. Perfect cover for someone who wanted to move without being seen. But perfect cover works both ways, and I started catching glimpses of movement in the tree line. A flash of color that didn't belong in the forest, the suggestion of a human shape moving parallel to the road. Always just at the edge of my vision, always gone when I looked directly. Someone was watching me work. The first direct evidence came during my second week. I was checking one of the remote ranger stations, just a small cabin with basic supplies and communication equipment, when I found that someone had been inside. Not broken in, the door was still locked. But things had been moved. The logbook was open to a different page. The radio was tuned to a different frequency. The emergency supplies had been inventoried and reorganized. Someone had a key. That night, I radioed back to headquarters and reported the incident. My supervisor, Jim, was concerned but not surprised. Sometimes maintenance crews or researchers accessed the remote stations and forgot to log their visits. He'd check the schedule and get back to me. But Jim called back an hour later with news that made my skin crawl. No one else was supposed to be in my area. No maintenance crews, no research teams, no other park personnel. According to the schedule, I was the only person authorized to access those service roads for the next month. Someone was out there who wasn't supposed to be. I started carrying my personal GPS and documenting everything. Every stop I made, every time I saw movement in the forest, every piece of evidence that someone was following me. The pattern that emerged was sophisticated and disturbing. Whoever was watching me knew my schedule better than I did. They could predict where I'd be at any given time, which roads I'd take, which stations I'd check. They stayed parallel to my route, but always remained hidden in the forest. But they were getting bolder. The radio interference started during my 3rd week, at exactly the same locations each day. Mile marker 12 on Forest Road 18, the junction of roads 23 and 31, the ranger station at Deadfall Creek. My radio would fill with static. Not random interference, but a pattern of static that sounded almost like Morse code. When I reported this to Jim, he sent a technician out to check the radio equipment. The tech found nothing wrong with my radio or the communication towers. The interference wasn't coming from equipment failure. Someone was jamming my communications. That's when I realized how vulnerable I was out there. No radio contact at specific locations, no cell phone coverage for 50 miles in any direction, backup personnel hours away even if they knew I was in trouble. If someone wanted to isolate me, they couldn't have chosen a better location. The notes started appearing after that. I'd return to my truck after clearing a fallen tree and find a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. Always the same neat handwriting. Good work clearing that cedar, David. You missed a spot on the erosion repair at mile 15. Your girlfriend called while you were working. She sounded worried. They knew about Sarah. Sarah was my girlfriend back in Denver. We talked every few days when I could get cell coverage, but I'd never mentioned her name on the radio or to anyone at the park. The only way someone could know about her was if they'd been monitoring my personal phone calls, or if they'd been to my apartment. I started varying my patrol schedule, trying to be unpredictable. Left earlier, some days, took different routes, skipped certain stations, and doubled back unexpectedly. Didn't matter. The boot prints still appeared exactly where I'd stopped. The notes still contained accurate details about my activities. They were adapting faster than I could change. During my 4th week, I found the campsite. It was about a quarter mile off Forest Road 23, hidden in a grove of old-growth cedar trees. Professional setup, military-grade tent, camouflaged to blend into the forest, positioned with clear sight lines to the service road, but invisible from any normal vantage point. Someone had been living out there for weeks. The campsite was temporarily abandoned, but I could see it had been occupied recently. A camp stove still had warmth in the metal. Sleeping bag was laid out like someone had just gotten up. And scattered around the camp were things that made my hands shake. Photos of me, dozens of them. Me working on the roads, checking ranger stations, eating lunch in my truck. Some taken with a telephoto lens from a distance, others taken from much closer. Close enough that the photographer would have been within 50 feet of me without me knowing. They'd been stalking me for weeks. But the photos weren't the worst part. Worse were the detailed maps of all the service roads with my typical patrol times marked in red ink. Floor plans of my apartment in Denver. Photos of Sarah taken outside her workplace. And at the center of it all, a notebook filled with observations about my behavior, my habits, my psychological responses to different situations. I was being studied like a lab rat. One entry read, "Subject becomes agitated when radio communications are interrupted. Increases patrol speed and skips routine maintenance checks." Another, "Subject carries personal GPS but doesn't understand he's being tracked through it." And the most disturbing, Subject isolation complete. Ready for direct contact phase. Direct contact phase. I grabbed what evidence I could carry and got out of there as fast as possible. But as I was leaving, I heard something that stopped me cold. Someone was whistling in the forest. A simple tune. Mary had a little lamb, but whistled slowly, deliberately. They knew I'd found their camp. I drove straight back to headquarters, breaking every speed limit on those winding forest roads. Jim took one look at my face and knew something was seriously wrong. When I showed him the photos and the notebook, he immediately called the county sheriff and the FBI. But by the time law enforcement reached the campsite, it was gone. Not just abandoned, completely cleaned out like it had never existed. Even the ground where the tent had been was covered with fresh forest debris. They were professionals. The FBI agent who interviewed me, Agent Martinez, said the setup I'd described was consistent with organized surveillance operations. Military or law enforcement training, sophisticated equipment, and resources that suggested this wasn't a single individual acting alone. Have you had any encounters with domestic terrorist groups, Mr. Thompson? Any conflicts with anti-government organizations or environmental extremists? I hadn't. I was just a park ranger doing routine maintenance. But Agent Martinez explained that sometimes these groups target federal employees to send a message or test their operational capabilities. I wasn't being stalked by a person. I was being stalked by an organization. They pulled me off the remote service roads and assigned me to the main visitor center while the investigation continued. For 2 weeks, everything was normal. Tourists, guided walks, educational programs, the kind of park work I'd originally signed up for. But they found me anyway. I was closing up the visitor center one evening when I found a note tucked under my car's windshield wiper. Same handwriting as before. Nice work at the visitor center, David. Much easier to watch you when you're around all those people. By the way, Sarah looks beautiful in that blue dress she wore to dinner last night. They were still watching, and they were watching Sarah too. I called Sarah immediately and told her to stay with friends, change her routine, be careful. But when I tried to explain what was happening, it sounded crazy even to me. A conspiracy of watchers following a park ranger through the forest? Sophisticated surveillance of a nobody with a forestry degree? But the evidence was real. The FBI investigation turned up more disturbing facts. Other park rangers in remote locations had reported similar incidents over the past 2 years. Always the same pattern: surveillance, notes, evidence of organized stalking. But the watchers always disappeared before law enforcement could make arrests. 3 rangers had requested transfers to other parks after being stalked. One had quit the National Park Service entirely, and one, a ranger named Mike Phillips in Yellowstone, had simply vanished while on a routine patrol. His truck was found abandoned on a service road, keys in the ignition, no sign of struggle. They were collecting park rangers. Agent Martinez recommended I take a leave of absence while they continued investigating. He couldn't guarantee my safety, especially if I stayed in remote assignments. The organization targeting me had resources and training that suggested they could find me anywhere in the park system. So I quit. I took a job with the Denver Parks and Recreation Department. City work, surrounded by people, never alone for more than a few minutes at a time. It felt like defeat, but it felt safer. For 3 months, everything was normal. Then I started noticing the same white pickup truck in different locations around the city. Always parked where it had a clear view of wherever I was working. Always gone when I tried to get a closer look. Distance doesn't matter. They'll always find you. Last week, I found a note tucked under my apartment. Dakor. Enjoying the city work, David? We prefer the forest, but we adapt. Sarah still looks beautiful, by the way. You should call her more often. They're still watching. They're always watching. I chose the top-floor apartment because I wanted privacy. No neighbors stomping around above me, no loud music or TV bleeding through the ceiling. Just me, my textbooks, and the quiet I needed to get through my psychology degree at the University of Vermont. My name is Sarah Chen, and I learned the hard way that sometimes the most dangerous place to be is alone at the top. The building was an old Victorian house that had been converted into 4 apartments. Mine was technically the attic space, with slanted walls and dormer windows that looked out over the campus. The landlord, Mr. Patterson, assured me there was nothing above my unit except roof space. No attic access, no storage area, nothing but wooden beams and shingles. He was wrong. The first signs were subtle. Late at night, usually around 11 p.m. when I was settling down to study, I'd hear sounds from above. Soft footsteps, like someone trying to walk quietly but not quite succeeding. When I mentioned it to Mr. Patterson, he insisted it was impossible. The roof space wasn't accessible, and even if it was, it couldn't support a person's weight. But the sounds were definitely footsteps. I started documenting them in my journal, treating it like a psychology experiment. Time, duration, pattern, location within my apartment when I heard them. What I discovered made me question my sanity. The footsteps always corresponded exactly to my movements below. When I walked from my bedroom to the kitchen, I'd hear movement above following the same path. When I sat down at my desk to study, I'd hear settling sounds directly overhead. When I got up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, footsteps would mirror my route. Someone was tracking my every movement. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was settling sounds from an old house. Maybe the acoustics were playing tricks on me. Maybe I was stressed from school and imagining things. But the pattern was too precise, too consistent to be coincidence. Then I noticed the tiny holes in my ceiling. They were barely visible, pinpricks in the white paint that you'd never see unless you were specifically looking for them. One above my bed, one above my desk, one above the kitchen table, one in the bathroom. Each hole was positioned to provide a clear view of the most private areas of my apartment. Someone was watching me. I bought a stepladder and examined the holes more closely. They'd been drilled from above, carefully positioned to minimize visibility from below. Fresh wood shavings around the edges suggested they'd been made recently, probably after I'd moved in. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Every moment in my apartment felt exposed, violated. I started changing clothes in the closet, studying in the windowless hallway, sleeping on the living room couch instead of my bed. My grades began to suffer, and my friends noticed I was becoming increasingly paranoid and withdrawn. That's when the sounds became responsive. Instead of just following my movements, whoever was above me started reacting to my activities. If I turned on music, I'd hear tapping sounds from above in rhythm with the beat. If I talked on the phone, the footsteps would move closer to the hole above wherever I was sitting. If I tried to study late at night, deliberate footsteps would start pacing back and forth, making concentration impossible. They were conditioning me. As a psychology student, I recognized what was happening. Classical conditioning, behavior modification, systematic manipulation of my environment to control my responses. Whoever was above me wasn't just watching. They were conducting experiments on me. I installed a small camera pointed at the ceiling above my desk. The footage I captured was terrifying. During the night, I could see shadows moving past the holes, blocking and unblocking the light from above. Sometimes, I could make out the outline of an eye looking down through one of the holes. Someone was living above me. I took the footage to Mr. Patterson and demanded access to the roof space. He insisted it was impossible. There was no entrance to the area above my apartment, no way for someone to be up there. But when I threatened to call the police and show them the video evidence, he reluctantly agreed to investigate. We found the entrance hidden behind a false wall in the building's basement. A narrow ladder led up through the interior walls to a space above my apartment that was much larger than Mr. Patterson had claimed. It had been converted into a crude living space with camping equipment, battery-powered lights, and a collection of surveillance equipment. Someone had been living there for months. The space was filled with notebooks documenting my daily routine, my class schedule, my study habits, even my phone conversations. Detailed psychological profiles analyzing my behavior patterns, stress responses, and reactions to different stimuli. Charts tracking how different types of noise at different times affected my sleep, my concentration, my emotional state. I'd been a test subject. But the most disturbing discovery was a collection of similar notebooks documenting other tenants. The previous resident of my apartment, a graduate student named Jennifer Walsh, had been subjected to the same surveillance and manipulation. Before her, another student named Maria Santos. Going back 3 years, at least 6 different tenants had been unknowingly studied by whoever was living in the hidden space. This had been going on for years. The police found evidence that someone had been accessing the space regularly. Fresh food, recent notes, equipment that had been used within days of our discovery. But whoever had been living there was gone, disappeared, without leaving any trace of their identity. Detective Morrison, who handled the case, found it was sophisticated and planned. The hidden entrance had been professionally constructed, probably when the building was first converted to apartments. The surveillance equipment was expensive and required technical knowledge to operate, and the psychological experiments showed a level of expertise that suggested advanced education in behavioral psychology. This wasn't random. This was professional. The investigation revealed that the building had a higher than normal tenant turnover rate, with most residents leaving after experiencing stress-related problems. Previous tenants had complained about noise, sleep disruption, feeling watched, and general anxiety that made it impossible to live comfortably. They'd all been test subjects. Dr. Williams, one of my psychology professors, reviewed the notebooks found in the hidden space and confirmed they contained legitimate psychological research methodologies. Whoever wrote these has advanced training in behavioral psychology, she told me. This is systematic research into stress response and behavior modification, conducted without consent or ethical oversight. It was human experimentation. I moved out immediately, but the psychological damage was already done. I couldn't sleep without checking for holes in the ceiling, couldn't study without feeling like I was being watched, couldn't trust that any private space was actually private. My academic performance never fully recovered, and I eventually changed my major from psychology to something that didn't require me to think about human behavior and manipulation. But it wasn't over. 6 months later, living in a new apartment across town, I started hearing familiar sounds. Soft footsteps above my ceiling late at night, always corresponding to my movements below. When I investigated, I found the same tiny holes drilled into the ceiling above my bed and desk. They'd followed me. This time, I didn't wait to gather evidence or try to rationalize what was happening. I packed a bag and drove to my parents' house in Massachusetts. I never went back to that apartment, never finished my degree at UVM, never returned to Burlington. But sometimes, even now, I hear footsteps above me. In hotels, in friends' houses, even in my parents' attic bedroom. The soft sound of someone trying to walk quietly, but not quite succeeding. The feeling of being watched from above, studied, cataloged, experimented upon. Some experiments never end. If you're still listening to this, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. I don't usually ask, but if this story is getting under your skin, show it some love. It really helps. I inherited my Uncle Raymond's lake house in northern Minnesota because I was the only family member who'd talked to him. Everyone else thought he was crazy, especially after the letters started coming. Letters about being watched, about people trying to drive him off his land, about conspiracies involving local developers and corrupt officials. My name is Michael Torres, and I wish I'd listened to those letters. Uncle Raymond died last March, officially ruled a suicide by the Itasca County Sheriff's Department. They found him in the lake, weighted down with chains, a note in his handwriting saying he couldn't take the pressure anymore. Case closed, property passed to me as his only heir. The lake house sat on 50 acres of pristine wilderness, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by old-growth forest and accessible only by a private dirt road. It should have been paradise, a software engineer's dream retreat from the noise and stress of Austin. Instead, it became my nightmare. The house itself was beautiful, built by my uncle in the 80s, when he retired from his job at 3M. 2 bedrooms, stone fireplace, wraparound porch overlooking the lake. But when I arrived to assess the property, I found signs that my uncle's final years hadn't been peaceful. Every window had multiple locks. Security cameras were mounted at every corner, though most had been smashed. Motion sensor lights were positioned around the entire perimeter, and scratched into the front door was a message: "Get out while you can." Uncle Raymond had been scared. Inside, I found his journals, boxes of them, documenting 5 years of systematic harassment. It started when Northwoods Development Corporation approached him about selling his land for a luxury resort project. When he refused, the harassment began. Dead animals left on his porch. Property lines surveyed and resurveyed. Complaints filed with the county about non-existent building code violations. His access road mysteriously washed out during heavy rains. His dock damaged by ice damage that looked suspiciously like axe marks. They wanted his land, but Uncle Raymond's journals described something worse than corporate pressure. Someone was living on his property, watching him from the forest, making noise at night to prevent him from sleeping. He'd find evidence of campfires in the woods, footprints around his house, garbage left near his property line. He was being terrorized. The first entry that made my blood run cold was dated 2 years before his death. "They're not trying to buy my land anymore. They're trying to drive me crazy so I'll sell cheaper, just abandon it. Last night someone threw rocks at my windows for 3 hours straight. When I called the sheriff, they said there was no evidence of vandalism. Local law enforcement wasn't helping. I spent my first week cleaning up the house and trying to make sense of Uncle Raymond's documentation. He'd kept meticulous records, photos of property damage, recordings of threatening phone calls, copies of every interaction with local officials. The pattern that emerged was systematic and organized. Someone wanted him gone. On my 8th night there, the harassment started up again. I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of someone walking around the house. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the gravel, circling the building like they were looking for something. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the windows, but whoever was out there stayed just outside the range of my light. They knew the property better than I did. The next morning, I found fresh footprints all around the house, leading to and from the forest. Whoever had been circling my house had also looked in every window, tried every door, and left a gift on my front porch. A dead raccoon, laid out neatly with its throat cut. The message was clear. I called the Itasca County Sheriff's Department and spoke with Deputy Hanson, the same officer who'd handled my uncle's case. He was polite but dismissive. Probably just kids playing pranks. Maybe poachers who didn't know the property had changed hands. He'd increased patrols in the area, but there wasn't much they could do about trespassers unless I caught them in the act. Same response Uncle Raymond had gotten. That night, they came back. This time, instead of just walking around the house, they started throwing rocks at the windows, not trying to break them, just making noise. Persistent, rhythmic impacts that made sleep impossible. When I turned on the outdoor lights, the rock throwing would stop, but it would resume as soon as I turned them off. They were training me to keep the lights on. I set up my own surveillance system, battery-powered trail cameras positioned around the property perimeter. The footage I captured over the next week was disturbing. Multiple individuals, always wearing dark clothing and staying at the edge of the camera range. They moved with purpose, knew exactly where the cameras were positioned, and seemed to be conducting organized harassment operations. This wasn't random vandalism. One night, I caught a clear shot of someone's face, a man in his 50s, wearing camouflage, carrying what looked like a walkie-talkie. I took the photo to Deputy Hansen and asked if he recognized the individual. His expression changed when he saw the photo. "That's Dale Morrison," he told me. "He works for Northwoods Development, handles their land acquisition projects." "But, Mr. Torres, I'm sure there's an innocent explanation for his presence on your property." The sheriff's department was involved. I started researching Northwoods Development Corporation and found a web of connections that explained everything. The company was owned by a group of investors that included the county commissioner, the sheriff, and several prominent local businessmen. They'd been systematically acquiring lakefront property throughout the region for a massive resort development. Project Uncle Raymond's land was the last piece they needed. The harassment escalated after I started asking questions. My car tires were slashed while I was at the county office researching property records. My cell phone service was mysteriously interrupted whenever I tried to make calls from the lake house. The access road developed deep ruts overnight that made it nearly impossible to drive without damaging my car. They were isolating me. Uncle Raymond's final journal entries made sense now. They're not going to let me live here in peace. They can't force me to sell, so they're going to drive me to suicide. Tonight, someone shot out my kitchen window while I was eating dinner. When I called 911, dispatch said all units were busy with other emergencies. They'd murdered him. The fake suicide note, the weighted chains, the convenient ruling by a corrupt sheriff's department. It all added up to murder disguised as mental breakdown. Uncle Raymond hadn't killed himself. He'd been eliminated because he wouldn't sell his land. And now they were trying to eliminate me. I found Uncle Raymond's hidden room in the basement, behind a false wall that looked like part of the foundation. Inside were copies of all his evidence, along with documentation he'd gathered about other property owners who died or disappeared after refusing to sell to Northwoods Development. There were 12 other cases, heart attacks, accidents, suicides, disappearances, all involving landowners who'd refused to sell to the development corporation. All ruled as natural deaths or unsolved cases by the same sheriff's department that was financially invested in the project. They'd been systematically murdering people for their land. I copied everything to a secure cloud drive and made arrangements to meet with an FBI agent in Duluth. But before I could leave the property, they made their final move. I woke up to find my car's brake lines cut and my phone service completely dead. The access road had been blocked with fallen trees, and when I tried to walk out to the main highway, I was turned back by men carrying hunting rifles, who claimed to be conducting a wildlife survey. I was trapped. That night, they surrounded the house. I could see flashlights moving through the forest, hear voices coordinating their positions. They weren't trying to hide their presence anymore. They were preparing for a final assault. But Uncle Raymond had prepared for this. In his hidden room, I found a shortwave radio and detailed escape plans. A boat hidden in a cove on the far side of the lake, supplies cached at predetermined locations, contact information for journalists and federal agents who'd been investigating rural land fraud. He'd known they would eventually come for him. I transmitted everything to the FBI contact on the shortwave radio, uploaded all the evidence files, and then followed Uncle Raymond's escape route. The boat was where he'd said it would be. along with enough supplies to reach a marina 20 miles away. I escaped, but just barely. The FBI investigation that followed uncovered the largest rural land fraud conspiracy in Minnesota history. 12 murders, dozens of fraudulent property transfers, corruption involving county officials and law enforcement. The Northwoods Development Corporation was disbanded, and 17 people were indicted on federal charges. But some of them got away. I sold the lake house to the federal government, which turned it into part of a protected wilderness area. Uncle Raymond would have liked that. His land preserved forever. No luxury resort. No development at all. But they're still watching me. Because 3 months ago, I started getting letters at my apartment in Austin. Neat handwriting, detailed information about my daily routine, threats about what happens to people who interfere with business interests. Last week, I found a dead animal on my apartment balcony, a cat with its throat cut, arranged exactly like the raccoon I'd found at the lake house. Distance doesn't matter. Some watchers never stop. 6 stories. 6 different watchers. 6 different ways that someone can make your life a living hell just by observing. The hospital security guard whose routine was learned and copied. The truck driver followed across state lines by organized stalkers. The single mother watched from the window across the street. The park ranger studied like a specimen in his own forest. The college student experimented upon from the space above her ceiling. The landowner murdered for refusing to sell. But here's what connects them all. In every case, the watchers weren't random. They were organized, professional, systematic. They had resources, training, and patience. They studied their targets for weeks or months before acting. And they all shared one terrifying characteristic. They never really stopped watching. Because the thing about being watched is that once you know it's happening, you can never fully trust that it isn't still happening. Every shadow, every repeated face in a crowd, every sense that someone is just slightly too interested in your routine, it all becomes potentially threatening. And sometimes it is. The stories I've shared tonight are true. The names have been changed, some details altered to protect privacy. But the core experiences are real. Real people, real watchers, real terror that continues to this day. If you made it through all 6 stories, you probably understand that feeling. The feeling that right now, someone might be learning your routine, mapping out your daily schedule, figuring out when you're most vulnerable, watching from a distance, taking notes, preparing for the moment when watching becomes something more direct. Maybe they are. Maybe they're not. But now you know what to look for. The subtle signs, the patterns, the escalation from observation to harassment to something worse. And if you ever find yourself in one of these situations, remember what happened to the people in these stories. Document everything. Trust your instincts. And never assume you're safe just because you can't see them. Thanks for listening. If you made it through the darkness, sleep well tonight. Someone has to.